What do you think makes a man truly attractive? Well, let me tell you, after today's episode, you're going to get the exact answer to that question. Because sometimes the most attractive man is the one covered in sawdust, with blistered hands from carving a wooden crib, and wrestling with a carp until he falls flat on his back in a tiny kitchen. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Guys, after all the overwhelming tension and tears from confronting Chairman Hoan, today we finally get to take a breath of the crisp, fresh air of the tea hill. Oh, and speaking of the wooden crib James is working so hard to build, it reminds me of our ongoing debate from the last episode. In the end, will the little one growing safely inside Diep be a little princess named Jade or a little prince named Lucas? Drop a comment down below and let me know your predictions. James and Diep definitely want to know too. The slanted morning sun filtered through the wooden window frame, casting dappled light across the floor. The thick fog from last night had completely lifted, leaving the tea hill with crisp, clear air, faintly carrying the earthy scent of damp soil and the fresh fragrance of dew-kissed young tea leaves. On the fleece-lined bed, Diep slowly stirred. She squinted against the early sunlight, unconsciously reaching down to gently rub her still flat lower belly. A profound sense of safety and tranquility coursed through her body. This morning, she didn't jolt awake in panic at the sound of tires crunching on gravel, nor did her chest tighten with the dread that someone might knock on the door and take this little life away. She turned to her side. James's spot was empty, the blanket neatly folded back, though it still held a lingering warmth and his familiar faint scent of sandalwood. From the porch, the steady shh, shh of sandpaper rubbing against wood echoed rhythmically. Diep draped a thin wool cardigan loosely around her shoulders, slipped into her slippers, and slowly stepped out the door. In the middle of the sunlit yard, James was squatting on the grass. Gone were the crisp suits and the aloof demeanor of a CEO. He wore a light gray t-shirt, already darkened with sweat across the back. His pant legs were hastily rolled up, his hair disheveled and dusted with sawdust. He was entirely engrossed in sanding a piece of pine wood, his eyebrows furrowed in deep concentration. Diep leaned her shoulder against the porch pillar, quietly watching his sturdy back. Her eyes inexplicably welled up. Memories of those suffocating, tear-filled days rushed back. Diep remembered the cold glares, the harsh, judgmental words from his father that had forced her to leave. She remembered the cold, hard agreement thrown at her, the times she had wanted to give up, wanting to lock herself in the dark to return him to his family's perfect world. That forbidding pressure had once been a massive storm threatening to swallow them both. But the man sitting right there had never backed down. He had turned his back on his family's expectations, shedding his prearranged career just to choose her. He stood as a shield against all the attacks, and now he willingly knelt on the dirt, covered in sawdust, meticulously carving each piece of wood to build a crib for their baby. This piece was bought with his unwavering resolve. Diep stepped down from the porch. "You're sanding too hard. You're going to get blisters all over your hands." James stopped and looked up. His eyes softened the moment he saw her. He stood up, hastily brushing the sawdust off his clothes. "Why are you up so early? The wind is still cold out here." He stepped closer, reaching out to pull her collar up, but suddenly remembered his hands were dirty and awkwardly pulled back. Diep proactively took his large hand and turned it palm up. Beneath the layer of sawdust, his usually smooth palm now bore two angry red blisters from the friction of the saw handle. "It's just a little scratch, no big deal," James said softly, nodding toward the rectangular wooden frame in the yard. "It's almost done. Look, it might not be glossy, but I guarantee it's the sturdiest crib in the world." I sanded the corners down perfectly. There won't be a single splinter to poke our baby's hands." Diep looked at him, her lips curving into the most radiant and peaceful smile from the bottom of her heart. "I know. Take a break and have some water, my carpenter. You still have that carp porridge you promised to cook for the baby." James cleared his throat, turned around, and rolled up his sleeves as he marched straight toward the kitchen. "Just you wait. These little chores can't beat me." But the reality in the small kitchen an hour later proved the exact opposite. The fresh carp lay on the wooden cutting board, slippery as ever. James fumbled, recalling the prep tutorial videos on the internet. He pressed his left hand on the fish's body, intending to use the back of the knife to scrape the scales backward. But the moment the blade touched it, the fish suddenly arched its body and gave a loud smack with its tail, splashing cold, fishy water right into his face. Startled, James loosened his grip. Seizing the opportunity, the fish slid off the cutting board, landed with a thud on the brick floor, and started flopping wildly. "Damn it!" James blurted out, quickly bending over to dive after it. But it was too slippery. He lunged and missed, falling forward and catching himself on his hands on the damp brick floor, watching helplessly as the fish wiggled its way into the gap under the dish rack. After finally wrestling the fish into the sink, the process of lighting the wood stove turned into a real disaster. Accustomed to everything running on an automatic push button, James stuffed a pile of dry branches he'd gathered from the hill tightly into the stove's mouth and lit it. Starved of oxygen, the fire died out, immediately belching a thick gray column of smoke. The smoke rose, stinging the eyes, seeping through every crack in the roof tiles and spilling out onto the porch. Diep's mother, who was hanging clothes in the yard, saw the billowing smoke and rushed in. "Good heavens! What are you doing making it smoke like the house is on fire?" Emerging from the smoke, James stumbled out, coughing violently. Tears streamed down his face, smudging the black soot on his cheek. Diep's mother looked at his battered state, both amused and exasperated. She charged into the kitchen, used a poker to push some of the wood aside, creating a gap in the middle. Instantly, a bright red flame flared up, and the smoke quickly dissipated. "How is the fire supposed to breathe if you pack the wood in so tight? Go outside and wash your face. Let me finish cooking. Diep will suffocate before she even gets to eat." James scratched his head, stepping out to the well looking embarrassed. As soon as he washed his face, he saw Diep leaning against the porch pillar, covering her mouth, shaking with laughter. He walked over, letting out a sigh, and pulled the towel hanging on the line to dry his hands. I know. Cooking with a wood stove isn't exactly my forte." Diep reached out, took the towel from his hand, and gently dabbed the remaining water droplets from James's chin. Her smile gradually faded, her eyes growing deep and profound. "Thank you, James. Thank you for everything." James closed his eyes, leaning his cheek into her soft palm. Amidst the pungent smell of kitchen smoke and the rustling of leaves, he found a stillness he had never known in his entire life. "I'm the one who should be thanking you for not giving up." Just then, the morning stillness was abruptly shattered. This morning, the dew on the tea hill was late to melt. Thao trudged along the hillside with her bamboo basket, picking baby corn. For the past few days, ever since their mother had left to secretly care for Diep at an undisclosed location, the young girl had been all alone in their little shack. As she passed the gravel slope leading up to the wooden house on the hill, Thao's footsteps suddenly halted. Right at the bend, a patch of dewy grass had been churned up. Deep tracks of wide car tires were etched into the damp soil. Those definitely weren't the tire marks of a local truck or motorbike. These churned mud tracks belonged to expensive, massive, heavy vehicles. Thau's heart skipped a beat. She shuddered. Could it be James's family? Were they hunting for her sister so relentlessly that they'd tracked her all the way up to this remote hill? At that thought, Thau didn't waste another second. She sprinted up the slope. As soon as she reached the crest, Thau burst into the dirt yard in a panic, her chest heaving violently. But then her steps faltered. She blinked in bewilderment. There was no struggle, no smashed furniture, no panicked tears like she had imagined the whole way running up here. On the corner of the porch, Diep was standing there, her smile more radiant and serene than ever. From the small kitchen, Diep's mother also hurried out, a wooden ladle still in her hand, looking at Thau in surprise. And in the middle of the yard, next to a half-finished wooden crib, the man in the dirty t-shirt covered in sawdust and ash was smiling at her. It was James. Thau let out a long breath, her shoulders slumping as if a 1,000-pound boulder had been lifted off them. It had been so long since the storms began that she finally saw her sister truly safe. When did you all get back here? Thau rubbed her chest to catch her breath, her voice cracking from the overwhelming shock and relief. Down the slope, there are these huge tire tracks. I thought... James grabbed a towel to wipe his hands clean, stepping over to Thau. I'm sorry the tire tracks from last night scared you. My dad was here. He paused a beat, his voice dropping low and serious. Everything is fine now, and I haven't had the chance to say this. Thank you for bravely telling me the truth that day at the shack, for pointing me in the direction to find Diep, so that Diep and I had the chance to be reunited. Hearing those words, the bridge of Thau's nose stung. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she forced a smile, shaking her head vigorously. Don't say that. I just wanted my sister to live a normal life, to not be bullied by anyone or forced to be separated anymore. You have to keep your promise, okay? Diep reached out and gently hugged her little sister's shoulders, her eyes rimmed with red. Diep's mother, standing nearby, also sneakily wiped the corners of her eyes. James looked at Thau, then turned to look at Diep, his chest filled with a profound sense of steadfastness. No one can tear apart or bully this family anymore, James said, his voice steady and resolute, like a sworn oath. My dad has backed down. Next month, Diep and I are getting married. This time, I'm going to hold you sisters' hands and walk down the aisle properly, and I won't let anyone have the right to judge her life ever again. Thau looked up, 2 tears rolling down her cheeks, but a bright smile bloomed on her lips. She nodded. A breeze swept up from the valley, gently rippling the endless rows of tea plants. There was no noise, no drama. Here on this corner of the hill, under the warm morning sun, the souls that were once covered in scratches were finally leaning on each other, welcoming a quiet and complete dawn. Following the overwhelming emotions of the morning, the rhythm on the tea hill slowly settled, giving way to a rare tranquility. The little house that used to sit in silent, cold mist was now beginning to radiate the warmth of daily life. As the sun began to fade, casting long shadows over the lush green tea bushes, James finished making his last pass with the sandpaper along the edge of the wooden crib. The crib, made of rustic pine wood, had no glossy paint, just a faint warm scent of raw tree sap. James carefully placed it in the corner of the bedroom. He stood still, looking at his clumsy creation that held all his devotion, the corners of his lips unconsciously pulling into a contented smile. Dinner that evening took place under the porch, bathed in the dim yellow light of a lantern and the faint smell of kitchen smoke. There were no long tables draped in pristine silk, no candlelight, and no servers standing silent as shadows. There was only a worn wooden table, the crackle of firewood, and the chirping of crickets echoing from the valley. The quietness of the meal wasn't empty at all. It was thick with a genuine sense of family, so real, it almost made you want to cry. Darkness gradually swallowed the hill. Mist seeped up from the ground, carrying the signature biting cold of the highlands. After dinner, Diep draped a thin cardigan over her shoulders, pulling the front panels close together, and slowly stepped out of the lit area of the porch. And then, her footsteps came to a complete halt. The small slope leading out to the gentle ridge, usually engulfed in pitch-black darkness, was now illuminated by 2 rows of hurricane lanterns scattered across the grass. That flickering yet steadfast yellow light wasn't loud or showy. It gently guided the way to a flat patch of grass where one could take in the entire starry sky of the valley. In the middle of that dew-scented grass, James was waiting for her. Under the vast, boundless sky of the universe, his unwavering presence was the only thing shining in Diep's eyes. James stepped forward. His eyes, usually as still as an autumn lake, were now brimming with intense emotion. He reached out, taking Diep's hand, which had grown slightly cold from the mist, and warmed it in his rough hands, bearing the fresh scratches from his woodworking that afternoon. "James, you..." Diep stammered, her heart racing. "Diep, look at me." James's deep, warm voice blended with the rustling wind over the tea hill. He looked deep into her eyes, utterly sincere. "This morning, I talked about our wedding, but..." James took a deep breath. "But that is only to make my family bow their heads in respect to you. Tonight, right here, it's just you and me." Diep held her breath. The corners of her eyes began to burn. James slowly let go of her hand. In the middle of the grass, soaked in the freezing night dew, the man slowly took a half-step back and knelt on one knee onto the damp earth in front of her. From his breast pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. When the lid popped open, a ring with a pristine diamond sparkling like a morning dewdrop was revealed. The design was rustic and elegant, embracing the gem just as he wanted to embrace her life. The man who was always resolute in the face of any crisis was now revealing his most genuine vulnerability and trembling. His eyes were red as he looked up at the petite woman before him. People used to humiliate you. They threw you out on the street in the pouring rain. They told you that you didn't have the right to be a wife, a mother. James's voice choked up, full of anguish. "But they didn't know that you were the only safe haven a lonely man like me has ever longed for. I've hurt you before. I've forced you to run away in fear. I can't turn back time to erase those scars, but from tonight onwards, your storms, your sky, please let me shoulder them." He took Diep's trembling left hand, pulled it gently toward his lips, and pressed a deep kiss onto the back of it, warming her icy fingertips. Then he looked up, his voice ringing out. "Diep, are you willing to spend the rest of your life giving me a home, a title as your husband, and the father of your child?" The proposal wasn't a handout. He placed her on the highest pedestal, lowering himself into the mud just to beg for her nod. Tears burst forth, rolling down Diep's flushed cheeks. The memory of that muddy, rainy night years ago flashed through her mind. The man who had held an umbrella for her in her absolute darkest moment of despair had finally cast aside every worldly barrier to kneel at her feet, asking to be her family. The deepest wounds and agonies in her soul were, in this very moment, completely incinerated. She sobbed, nodding repeatedly, covering her mouth with both hands to hide her cries of sheer happiness. "I do, James, I do." The corners of James's lips stretched into a radiant smile, shedding every burden. His hands shook slightly as he slid the ring onto her slender ring finger. The moment the ring sat obediently on Diep's hand, James sprang to his feet. He reached out his firm arms, wrapped them completely around her waist, and lifted her off the ground. Diep threw her arms around his neck, laughing out loud amidst her tears. The crystalline laughter echoed into the misty night, dissolving into the air that carried a faint scent of tea. He gently set her down, cupping his wife's delicate face in both hands, wiping away her warm tears. Under the star-filled sky of the valley, amidst the caressing breeze, he leaned in. They shared a deep, slow, and passionate kiss. Gone was the rush, gone was the fear and separation. It was a kiss of eternal bonding, sealed by the heavens, the earth, and the misty hill. In the quiet darkness of the porch corner, Diep's mother leaned against the door, using the hem of her shirt to quickly wipe her wet eyes. Next to her, Thao was also sniffling from emotion. The two women quietly witnessed the most beautiful moment in Diep's life, smiling in contentment. The cruelest storm had receded, leaving behind a sky that was peaceful, crystal clear, and overflowing with a love that was finally blossoming. A proposal without vibrant red roses, without a loud symphony orchestra or extravagant candlelight. Just a man kneeling on the damp earth, asking to be a safe haven for the woman he loves. How did you guys feel about James's proposal under the glow of the hurricane lanterns? Personally, reading this part actually made me tear up because I was just so incredibly happy for Diep. The wounds of the past have finally been completely healed. But will James's announcement of a super wedding next month go as smoothly as planned? When Diep officially steps through the grand doors of James's family, will high society accept her so easily? All of this will be revealed in the upcoming videos. If today's video brought you a sense of peace and healing, don't hesitate to hit that like button, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss James and Diep's wedding of the century. Thank you so much for always tuning in and listening. Have an absolutely wonderful day. Bye for now, and see you next time.